Mr. Gordon Mikola. Is Mr. Gordon present? Yes, he is here. Head of the Landscape Engineering Faculty of the Kharkiv National Agricultural University, named after the Kuchayev. Agrochemical materials, phyto recultivation and fertility reproduction of soil. I would like to congratulate my colleagues with this day. Some time ago, there was one expert in soils, Professor Dokuchayev. Yesterday, we had the International Day of Soils. Very soon there will be International Day of Soils in Kharkiv. My information to some extent is of conceptual nature. It is a product of cooperation between our team and Karazin University. Unfortunately, two of our colleagues are dead, and Professor Zaritsky and Professor Andreev, who used to be our co-contributors, our research fellows in this project, and wrote the textbook on geology, where for the first time the agrochemical raw materials were mentioned. We devote this presentation. We are very grateful for this opportunity to present results of our work. Titkovsky Technologies once paid attention to our work also. It was just an introduction. I hope that I will comment very shortly on my 25 slides. Agrochemical raw materials, these are chemicals which could be used as fertilizers, chemical recultivators. These are phosphate, potassium, calcium, and other salts. And for fertilizers, it is important that that could be introduced into soil without any damage to this soil. That is, the concentration of chemicals is not, or high concentration of chemicals is not that important. Phosphate and nitrate salts are of less importance for us, and here I insist on the use of raw salts. Quite often they are processed in Ukraine. Like potassium salines, nitres, phosphorites, gypsum. Besides this traditional potassium and phosphate salts, we process limestones, chalks, peat, sapropel, and their waste from these processes and then we can use them as agrochemicals, one of the mostly widespread among local carbonates are widely used. For example, the use of carbonates considerably increase the fertility of soils. In old Soviet times, Ukraine managed to reach 160 tons of wheat from 1 hectare of land due to the addition of lime into soil. The carbonate among the carbonate fertilizers, I could mention phosphate chokes, which is much more effective than water dissolving phosphates, because it can act for 3 years, then provide multiplying effect and thus raise the fertility. I also would like to draw your attention to the waste from sugar production, which is called defecate, which is similar to manure and has the same properties. When we come to lime, and we suggested to use smaller amounts of limes and add it to fertilizers. Even in small content, they allow to reach rather high fertility and collect much bigger yield from the same areas of land. And the liming, the process of liming was well studied in our department, and actually we had created the school of those scholars who developed this trend of lime use and gypsum use in the production of fertilizers.
Out of these formations, we would like to mention the biggest Pridnestr formation, where the open production, open development could be done. Enough gypsum was produced from there. The next one is phosphate raw material. Phosphorus is what the plants need from the first days of growing. We need to, at least in the past, the phosphorus was added to soil for growing beetroots. Phosphate fertilizers were introduced into the soil. More than 90% of the world production of phosphate goes for production of fertilizers. But we don't have appetites in Ukraine. And also you know that in Sumy there are mountains of phosphorus gypsum. The requirement of Ukraine is not satisfied in phosphate raw material, and I would like to mention the perspectiveness, how the reserves of phosphates could be used, which are in our ground, in our subsoil. The black soil is rich but greedy. That's how this black soil was characterized. Then calcium is the element of youth. It plays in the potassium. Potassium is of importance. The potassium raw material plays an exceptional role in the development of the plants. Potassium is that the amount of potassium goes down when we transfer from when we transfer to sand and peat soil. But basically the chemical analog of potassium, which is natrium, and chlorides and chloride sulfides are mostly widespread, but chlorine, this all could be used as fertilizer. The Kalush, Wolinski and Stebninsky fields are developed but beetroot loves potassium. Then peat and sapropel, that's where the humus regime is stabilized. Peat and sapropel is the fertilizer which has nitrogen in it. And there are many fields. There are about 1.5 billion tons of peat, about 800,000 or 800 million burnt, about 19 go for fertilizers, but here I would express my doubts, because people look yesterday I was looking for this book, The King of Turfs. The author presented me this book, that's ethno-cultural symbol of Ukraine, the hem. Basically, when the phosphorus and potassium as saline are to be introduced into the soil, as well as copper. And I remember there's a spade which does not get to the top of the hemp. Just yesterday I thought about that, and nitrogen and all other soils was number one problem. The next slide, sapropels. They are rich in potassium, phosphorus, and different macro and micro elements. They're granulated with peat. They feed cattle with it. Sapropel helps increase of the fertility, and it's not used in our country. Russia and Belarus are exporting them. It's basically for a currency. And then let's remember the works of Professor Kristel, then saponites, because of their unique properties. It's not what is the property of the soil. It's a different type of a property. It's unique, and they are used for feeding cattle, for reclamation of land, for treating contaminated grounds or soils, and the content of cesium in the milk of a cow, which are fed saponite, is reduced by 75%. But Ukraine uses saponites mostly for reclamation of land and feeding cattle. Now the next slide. And this is from Zaritsky, introducing fertilizers transforms biochemical cycles. So their use should be balanced. It should be harmonized with the needs of plants, animals, and people. Violating that is not shouldn't be allowed. Professor Liebig did not recommend to introduce nitrogen fertilizers. Now there are 5 or 6 nitrogens. It is turned into European quality nitre, and it goes for export. We should be exporting not even grain, but what Italians export, pasta. And also I made another discovery for myself, which is known for microbiologists, what our chemical industry is working on, and that is using Russian gas. The cost of nitre includes half of the cost of gas. What our azotes are working on, these different plants, the same amount of gas goes into the atmosphere.
Bacteria. Nitrates for plants are like drugs. We need this potassium that I mentioned, then
talking about this chain, soil, plant, animal, human being. The soil accumulates, then the harvest, transporting the yield, during the transportation we break this chain. Then nitrates, they are washed down into the groundwaters. So here's the idea of Zaritsky, it's very famous. Introduce the phosphorites, and one more thing, the shortage of minerals forces humanity to look for replacement, copper, aluminium, but what's important, essential, phosphorus, potassium, nitrogen, in fertilizers, they cannot be replaced by anything. During the millions of years of evolution, animals and people got adapted to these elements and their proportions. And the next slide gives you an example, that's a fresh example, and it shocked me. Now people are talking that we don't have this proportion of plants and animal food. Poltavska veterinary station, it's more than 100 years. On the eroded soil they grow the rye. And in this period of time the annual yield is 11-12 100 tons per hectare. And then the specialists say if during these 100 years we didn't have reclamation of land, and where would we be and how would we live? I am almost finishing. Then we move from open development to reclamation. We are the experts on phyto reclamation. The journalists say that the gas reserves take the second position, but this is the myth that we have the most fertile soil on Earth. This soil degrades. It's not gold and diamonds which are the wealth of Ukraine, but this brown soil which formed the most fertile soil in the world. All these rocks, with some exceptions, they become poisonous and they become phytotoxic. And that's how the soil was different from rock. We grow different plants there. On sand soil we grow different fruit and vegetables. degraded land becomes the environment for plants, and that means that phytocultivation cultivation becomes a pragmatic field of economy. Now, the idea of Vernadsky, that's the basis of the strategy of sustainable development, initiation of actions that has been mentioned. What are our capacities? It would be great if the state allocates same money for environmental protection as for defense. That's the author's idea about creation of the landscape park Shahrukh. It was introduced into the strategy of development, and if the Congress supports it, we'll be happy. And the final slide, you see the park which was planted by man artificially. Thank you.